You know something? You know something? If you had told us 1 year ago that we were going to
get modal double-faced cards,
we would have given anything for that. And you know something? You know something? Not only are we going to
Umara Skyfalls,
Tom Harkin, we're going to
Skyclave Basilica, Aquum Teeth, Balaged Sanctuary, Colony Territory, Sajiri Glacier, Balakut Stoneforge, Spikefield Cave, Zoff Blood Bog, Songmad Ruins, Makindi Mesas, Kabira Plateau, Kazul's Cliffs,
and then we're going
Amiria Shattered Skyclave,
to take back the White House! Ah!
Woo! Spoiler season, Anthony.
Oh my god.
Ooh, spoiler season.
So exciting. Best times of the year.
Ooh, the best. So good. I just love looking at new Magic cards. It just gives such texture to the week to have new Magic cards popping up all over the place. I think Wizards does a really good job with their spoiler season deal, where they give all these different community members different preview cards that come out over the course of like 2 weeks. I think it's really smart. I'm into that.
Yeah.
Anyway, we don't have a preview card yet, Anthony, but you're listening to Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy, and I'm here with my co-host, Anthony, Color Pie Defender Maddox. Have I used that name before, Anthony?
I don't think so.
Because it's one that I would like to use for you often. It is a big trait of yours. I think about it often. And we have a very important Color Pie judgment we need from you, because I know this is very important to you, and so I want to know what you think of Feed the Swarm.
Do we have to?
Yes, we have to.
Is this really necessary?
We have to, and we're going to get it out of the way, and then we're just going to move on with the rest of the episode. Feed the Swarm,
you know what?
Do you think?
The thing is it's just not up to me. The pie has changed out from beneath me, and I can't control that. It's a whole new pie.
But you can have an opinion about it, Anthony. Like, do you think this is a good color pie change? Do you think this is a bad color pie change? Do you think that, as I've seen some other people posting this week, that the color pie no longer exists, basically, and it's basically been banned from the game? What do you think?
Yeah. I'm honestly fairly neutral. So, I mean, the card in question, Feed the Swarm, is basically just a targeted enchantment removal in black, which is not something we have seen before. And I know this is something that has sort of been in the works for a while. They've introduced a couple, like, sort of enchantment edict effects that make your opponent sacrifice some of their enchantments. Yep. So it's been something that has been on the horizon. Basically, from what I understand about the design process, they were like, well, we have all these different colors that have these limitations. This particular limitation isn't actually adding that much interest. And it had sort of like overstayed its welcome, I guess, for a while, specifically because they make a lot of these sort of like pact with the devil type enchantments where you cast an enchantment and it does like some good things and then some very bad things to you. So they don't really want to negate all those cards by giving black a way to just destroy them outright. So yeah, I mean, I always would advocate for making the colors as different as possible to add as much variety to the gameplay and as much like symmetrical or asymmetry that's still in balance. So I'm not crazy about it, but also I see why this is sort of fine space for them to go in.
I think this is great. I'm also a big color pie defender.
Hot take.
I'm also a big color pie defender. You know, I think it is essential to the game, and honestly, one of the most interesting things about the game, period. Like, as we've mentioned briefly, I have these monocolored starter decks that I've designed for teaching people how to play Magic, and part of the reason I like to teach people that way is that I think starting with a monocolored deck is by far the best thing to do because, A, you don't have to worry about non-basic lands, a whole category of cards you don't have to bother explaining or talking about. It's just your deck only has mountains in it or whatever. But B, I tried very hard to make each of those sort of decks embody certain aspects of the colors so that even a brand new player to the game immediately gets a sense of like what these colors do. And I think it provides a lot of depth and importance to the game. So I'm a huge defender of the color pie. I don't think we should just give, white, uncomplicated card draw and, whatever. But I think that the like color pie barrier of just this color can't interact with this other card type at all is like one of the worst manifestations of the color pie. And I'm glad to see any of those go away, basically. Like if you look at how, creatures are like an essential part of the game and have been since its invention, right? And so there's no color that can't interact with creatures at all, right? Blue has counter spells and bounce spells, black and red have like actual straight up removal. White usually has very close to unconditional removal or removal that can possibly be undone or whatever. Green gets fight spells, so you can kill a creature as long as you have a bigger creature. Like, there's a different approach to the problem for each color as opposed to just saying like, Red can't even has nothing in a rules text box that like interacts with creature cards. I just think it's not great for the game to do that. And for the people that are saying like, oh, the color palette doesn't matter anymore, if that were the case, then we would have constructed decks that were just using all mono black, because now mono black's OP because it can destroy enchantments. And obviously that's not the case, right? Black being unable to destroy enchantments is not what's making people play multicolored decks and constructed or whatever. It is the functional job of the color pie is to keep these things separate so that you are motivated to strike this balance between playing multiple colors to get advantages from all of them but not going so far that you're taxing your mana base and making your deck uncastable. So I think this is a great change. I'm happy to see it, and I trust the current team at WotC to not take away our color pie, our beautiful, precious pie.
Yeah, I mean, I would emphasize that one of the important things about the color pie and making all the colors play in distinct ways is the weaknesses. It's not just that different colors have different strengths, but they're also just things that colors can't do. But I think that in this particular case, red can't really deal with enchantments, black can't really deal with artifacts, and so the fact that black also couldn't deal with enchantments just felt like it was a little bit too much of a burden on the color.
Yeah. And I would say that like any color's strength is every other color's weakness, right? Like I think it's just two takes on the same thing. I don't think a weakness has to be like a total blind spot, I guess. Like I don't think the huge blind spots are particularly useful. It's just like, well, my opponent's playing an enchantment-based deck, so I guess I just can't win now. As opposed to saying like, my opponent's playing an enchantment-based deck, they are favored or whatever, and I have to like think about it. Anyway, I think it's great. Feed the Swarm. Seems like a good card. I wish it was either instant speed or 1 mana for my own cube.
Never enough.
It's never enough for cube.
Well, it's also 1 mana destroy target creature.
Well, it does. I mean, we already have Vendetta, which is 1 mana instant destroy target creature. You lose life equal non-black creature. You lose life equal to its converted mana cost, which I would very happily be cubing if not for the non-black creature rider, which I still just can't abide. I try to avoid that as much as I can.
That's a really great point to bring up, though, that even though we want to sort of appreciate everything that's great about the game, it is really awesome when we see them actually being a little bit more reflective and say, well, we've just done this forever, like, why would we change it? When they stopped doing the destroyed non-black creature, I think that was a really good move for the game, so that's valuable to be aware of. When they're making these changes, they're not doing it for no reason.
Oh, of course not. They're thinking about it a lot, and also I would say that, like, there's just a lot of change aversion. Like, people that are mad about this, like, if you sat down from a blank slate and explained this game to somebody that didn't get it, and then you got to the part where you were like, oh, and by the way, like, black can't destroy enchantments. It's like, why? What value is being imparted to the game by that specific thing? And the answer, I don't think, is not very much. So I'm glad to see it happening. And I'm always glad to see the game changing. I think the game changing is pretty much always for the best. And Magic is a better game now than it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago or whatever. So I embrace the change,
Blasphemy.
Anthony.
All right, so the big question is then, should I put Feed the Swarm into my mono black cube?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
I mean, did you feel like part of the design consideration was that enchantments are non-interactable, therefore I will, include ones that would otherwise maybe be suspect because I know you can't remove them?
That was definitely part of the design, but I think that more affected artifacts than enchantments. So I think the bigger reason why I would be apprehensive at this point is just because the effect is so rare. It would feel like very high variance. So you could say, well, this effect is almost certainly never going to be interacted with, except if my opponent has like one of these literal 2 cards that can interact with it. So I feel like if I design the cube, 3 years from now when we have a dozen sort of interchangeable effects, then I would be much more likely to be totally comfortable just putting it in there.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. And there is a lot of value, I think, to, not having a bunch of totally random, like, one-of hosers. I guess I feel like the destroying an enchantment is just not that huge of a hose, It's like if occasional upside on what is otherwise a very reasonable removal spell. That's what it seems like. We've got a lot of good removal in this set so far.
True.
All right, so this episode, I think we're going to talk a lot about these modal double-face cards. We talked very briefly about them the day that we discovered they were a thing, but we've had a lot more spoilers come out and a lot more time to sort of simmer on this idea. And I mean, frankly, these are the things I'm just most excited about this new set. And I've been talking a lot about on the Discord, and just they are kind of consuming my brain space. I'm not sure about you, so I want to get into that a little bit. And then we have some other topics here we might get into, but that's where we're headed after we do our Pack 1 Pick 1, which we of course do every week from a listener submitted cube. And this week we are doing a cube submitted by listener Tristan, aka Nomad. And this is an unpowered budget cube that I believe at some point was branched off from Sully Singleton's board game cube. So we had actually talked about budget limited cubes here before, Anthony, but it's obviously an important consideration for a lot of players out there. A lot of people, are not playing cards with big price tags and don't have the sort of resources to dump whatever they want to their cube. And so it's an interesting design space to play with that I think leads interesting places to cards you might not normally run. So you want to read these cards to us?
All right, wow. Well, I've got to say, even though this is a budget cube, it is not necessarily an unpowerful cube. First card out of the gate is Simic Signet.
Signets are great. We haven't actually had a Signet conversation on this show before. This is, I feel like this is one of those topics that all cube designers weigh in on at some point, and it's a very important design consideration. Like, are you going to run Signets? Are you going to include them? And the reason is because just giving any deck access to jump from 2 to 4 mana in one turn is a huge sort of tempo swing that really any deck is kind of happy to take, except kind of aggro. I mean, most aggro decks don't want to spend a card on just getting additional mana, but any mid-range or control decks. So so far I'm on Simic Signet, and I'm very happy about it.
I'm on Signet, and I'm sad about it. Next up, another cool card from Jumpstart, Witch of the Moors.
This one I don't know. You have to read it to me.
Okay, so this is the 5-mana 4/4 with Death Touch. But at the beginning of your end step, if you gain life this turn, each opponent sacrifices a creature, and you return a creature from your graveyard to your hand. So, I mean, the illustration for this card is amazing. It's sort of the evolution of the Tempting Witch from Eldraine, where all those little hands in its chest have emerged with all kinds of trinkets.
And I think the card is quite strong. You mentioned it. This definitely seems like a good life game payoff. I'm not going to start on it over a Signet, though.
Fair enough. All right, so next card is Mental Note. 1 mana, mill 2 cards, draw a card.
Yeah, that is basically the almost functional copy of Thought Scour. Thought Scour, you can target a player, and Mental Note is just always you. Yeah, I mean, cantrips are good. Most people, I don't see putting this in cubes unless they are explicitly doing some conscious graveyard synergies. I mean, I think arguably it's playable in most cubes, because even if you're not doing conscious graveyard strategies, you probably have a couple delve cards or something, like just incidental value, and cantrips are good. But yeah, still Signet. I mean, I think it's going to be hard to take me off Signet. I'm going to go ahead and just say that this will probably be my pick through most of the pack. Let's see if we can unseat it, though.
All right, next up is Pristine Talisman.
3 mana, tap for a generic gain of life, right?
Yep.
2 mana rocks are better than 3 mana rocks in general, so I'm going to stick with the 2 mana one.
It is interesting looking at just these 4 picks. It does seem like there's a little bit of a theme in that we have our Witch of the Moors, and we have something that both mills cards and something that gains life. So, without being really familiar with the cube, I already feel like I'm getting some of the themes, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, next so far it is very, very consistent.
Next up, we have Porcelain Legionnaire. Does this unseat the Signet for you?
So, this gets into an interesting question of, like, am I drafting this pack blind, or am I looking at the list? The actual fact of the matter is I'm looking at this list here. I happen to be. If I was blind coming to this pack, I would definitely be on Signet. If I knew the cube and knew that aggro was very consistently performing well, I think there's a very strong argument that starting on Legionnaire is just as good, if not better. From looking at this list, I'm going to stick with the Signet, I think. This is a 420 card cube, so it's bigger than a 360, and there certainly are, quite a bit of 1-drops and quite a bit of aggro support, but just from the density of those things and the fact that we're, playing budget, so we're probably going to be avoiding some of the most, peak cards, I think I'm probably going to be trying to do something a little more value than tempo-oriented.
I think I'm in exactly the same spot. So next up, I don't think this is going to do it for you either. Hanged Executioner.
No, I think the card's cool, but I'm not going to take it here.
All right, how about Neutralize?
Cool, valuable card as well, but yeah, also not going to take that. I expect both those cards to be like mid-pack cards.
Yeah, I agree. Next up is Burning of... You're going to have to help me with this.
I've heard it as Burning of Xingye, but I do not know if that is actually true. That's just what I've heard other streamers say, so...
Well, fortunately, you don't have to say it. You just need to put it on the table and point.
My goal is to take this Signet and then wheel Burning. That's my plan currently.
That sounds like a solid plan.
Burning is the functional duplicate of Wildfire, for those that are not familiar. It is the Wildfire from the starter decks. Portal 3 Kingdoms.
We have a Geist-Honored Monk.
That is the white 5-drop, right?
Correct, yeah. 5 mana for a power and toughness is equal to the number of creatures you control. It's got vigilance and enters the battlefield with 2/1/1 white spirits with flying. So it's 5 mana for, I guess, a 2/2 and 2 more 1/1 flyers. So it's pretty good value.
Yeah, it seems like a perfectly serviceable card, but not going to take me off Signet.
How about Eliminate? Destroy
very good removal spell,
creature
but
or planeswalker.
But yeah, still not gonna pry me off of it. I'm gonna pry this signet from my cold dead hand so far.
I don't think we're gonna manage to. Will Myr Battlesphere do it for you?
I mean, it's a very fun 7-drop. It's probably one of the more fun ways to win the game in most cubes, but no, I expect, we already have seen a couple of good 5s. I expect I will get plenty of ways to win the game. I don't have to prioritize taking one first. Even though it is colorless, it's 7 mana, which means you are not taking an open pick because it is colorless. You are basically saying, I'm going to close myself off to all decks that can't cast 7 drops, which is many decks. So I'll start with the ramp and get the big payoffs later.
Yeah. SRAM's Expertise is our next card. So this is a 4 mana, make 3 servos, and you can cast a 3 CMC or less card from your hand.
This Expertise cycle was an interesting one for Cube. I when I first saw them, I thought they were going to be very potent because, in some ways, SRAM's Expertise costs a single mana, right? And 1 mana for that effect is great. You can say the same for Baral's Expertise or Yeheni's Expertise. Those cards all seemed very promising on their face. But most of them, they pretty much all played out worse than I expected them to, just because none of them are super cheap. I think the cheapest one is Kari Zev's Expertise at 4 mana. It's a 4 mana threaten that lets you. No, I think it's still 3 mana actually, but maybe it only threatens creatures of a certain size or something. Is there a limitation on what it can threaten?
I think it just works.
It's 1 red, I guess, instead of 2 red.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, so that's the cheapest one, but then you get to play a 2-drop or whatever. Yeah, it's just that any card that makes you sequence your hand in anything other than what would be the normally optimal way to sequence your hand usually plays out worse than it looks, because you're either, spewing off value because you're saying, well, I've got this board wipe in hand, but I'm not going to play my 3-drop, before I play Yeheni's Expertise, whether it could be an artifact or a planeswalker or something. You're like, I'm going to wait to get this value off of casting Yeheni's Expertise, and then you played off tempo or whatever. That mechanic did not play out super well, and so the card I think is fine, but I'm not going to take it here.
Kari Zev's Expertise also lets you steal vehicles. I didn't forget about that part.
Right, it does. Interesting.
All right, 3 more cards. We have Sky Sovereign Consul Flagship.
This is a much better colorless bomb to start on than Myr Battlesphere, in my opinion, which might be a hot take. But 2 mana cheaper is a big difference. The sort of caveat on the big Skyboat is that it's not going to be great to control that, because if you can't crew it, you can't crew it. There was a time where I used to think that Skyboat was, the best green 5-drop in Cube. And actually, honestly, it still might be. Am I running any 5s in my Cube right now? I'm running a couple. I have, the Deep Forest Tournament and stuff. So it's really like a kind of a mid-rangey card, but a very, very good mid-rangey card. But still not going to take me off Signet. Maybe I'll wheel that. I'm going to wheel either that or Burning, surely.
I think that would be not unlikely. Next card is Impulse.
Yeah, not going to take me off of old Signet.
And last but not least, Rurik Thar the Unbowed.
This is a card I have been curious to try in Cube because I think what keeps it from being viable is any lack of any kind of trample. It's a 6/6 with Visual Reach that attacks every turn if able, and then if your opponent casts a non-creature spell, it domes them for 6, which is a lot. Actually, it counts you too.
Well, I think, it counts you as well. So I think in your cube specifically, the problem would be a lot of your threats in a mid-range red-green deck or planeswalkers.
Yeah, that is true. It would hit you on your own planeswalkers. They would all come down before this thing, was played, because none of them cost 6 mana or more. So theoretically, this could be your curve topper. But and then basically always dealing at least 6 to your opponent if they have a removal spell seems good. But yeah, again, 6 mana. I'm going to wheel one of these big 5 or 6 mana spells, though, and I'll be very happy to already have a Signet in my deck when I wheel them.
Yeah, it's really hard not to take the Signet here. I think that if I'm going to make my hot take, I really don't like Signets for a couple reasons. One of them just being that they are a symmetrical cycle, that a lot of people include the entire cycle of all 10 in their cubes. And again, if people enjoy that, people should play what they enjoy. But for the kind of draft experience I like, this opportunity to just say, whatever colors I'm drafting, I always get this access to the Signets. Just takes away from that exact same, asymmetry of the color pie that I really enjoy. And I think they are just, so potent, costing just 2 and fixing your mana so well, that if you're doing any kind of lower-powered cube, and you're including the Signets, it just enables the sort of 5-color pile problems so easily.
Yeah, I started, my cube initially had all 10 Signets in there, and then I cut all of them because I came to a similar conclusion, and I was I want aggro to be better, and I don't want every single deck to be sort of kind of encroaching on the space that green should have an advantage in. And then what I ended up doing eventually was adding back in some of them. So I have a selection of 2-mana rocks that can produce basically some subset of blue. Looking at this list, this person is not, Tristan here is not playing all 10. They are playing, interestingly, kind of the opposite of what I'm playing. They're playing all of the green-based signets and none of none of the non-green-based signets. So they're basically, I mean, truly, I think of a signet as basically a colorless card. The reason I chose to include the blue ones is just because I was like, well, I'm going to include, 4 to 6 of these. I might as well include the ones I think are the best colors that want this effect the most. But truly, like, if I included, Boros Signet or Selesnya Signet, those decks would be only 2% less happy to play those cards instead. So really, they're colorless cards. And yeah, I agree with you. I think they are one of the biggest offenders of that sort of 5-color good stuff deck. If it is viable in your environment, it's often because of signets. And I think breaking cycles, I think was kind of a level up moment for me very early in my cube design days, because people oftentimes approach a cube like you're designing a set, because that's the only precedence we have for designing any kind of Magic product. You think about a constructed set and how it's been designed for drafting, and cycles are present in those sets, and what they do is they establish a pattern that players can then learn, and you get the satisfaction of seeing that pattern completed, and it reduces cognitive load a little bit because you can sort of shortcut things and say, oh, this is just this version of that effect or whatever. But in Cube, it so oftentimes tramples over what would otherwise be the right balance of effects for an environment. Like 10 2-mana rocks at a 360 card cube is just so many 2-mana rocks. It's a lot. Having the full cycle just really kind of hems you in there. It's not that the individual signet is so good. I mean, it is, but usually the problem with signets is that people have all 10 of them, and having 10 in the environment is a surefire way to just let people play signets and, anything that costs 4 or 5 mana that is good in any color, and kind of trample all the decks that have strategy. But yeah, I don't think that's happening here, because we only have a few signets, so I'm happy to have gotten one of them. First pick.
Yeah, seems like a strong place to start.
I would, my second pick here is, I think, definitely the Legionnaire, though. I'm not sure if that's your second pick as well.
It's close for me. I'm actually really tempted by Witch of the Moors, just because even just looking at this one pack, it seems fairly supported, and it's a card I've never played with before, and it seems like it has a very high ceiling. I don't think that would be the correct choice, but if I was drafting with my heart, that's where I'd be.
That's one of the best things about Cube. You can do whatever you want. Test out a new hypothesis every time you sit down to the table, because usually we're drafting with no stakes, which is a nice part of our casual format. All right. Thank you so much, Tristan/Nomad, for sending in your cube list. If you would like to be like Tristan and have us talk about your cube on Lucky Paper Radio, you can email a link to mail@luckypaper.co and include your name and your pronouns, and we will add it to our spreadsheet and do it on the air sometime. All right, Anthony, I'm just itching to talk about model double face cards. I'm amped about these. First, I just have to say, gosh, that white mythic, ooh, it's so good, Anthony. It's like,
really? That's the one that stands out to you?
Are you surprised?
I'm surprised.
Which one did you think was going to stand out to me?
Anything but just like a giant sorcery that makes a bunch of angels.
Well, so here's the thing. Like, I like flexible spells, I like scalable spells, I like cheap spells, I like being able to cast lots of things in the same turn, I like optimizing for decision points for my players. So yes, normally...
None of those things sound like casting a, 8 mana?
7 mana sorcery.
7 mana sorcery?
It's 4 white for the sorcery side. Yeah, none of these things seem like I would be the person that would like to pay 4 white to make 2 4/4 angels. But the beauty of these cards, which is the same thing as the beauty of like cycling, for example, the cheap cycling cards, is that they allow you to put cards in your deck that I would never in a billion years put in my deck, right? Like if I just included the spell side of this in my cube, I would never put it in any deck ever. I mean, ever. I would rather run another land, probably. I'd rather go up to like 18 lands in my control deck than run a 7 mana sorcery. It just is not going to get there. So the beauty of this is that I get to put it in my deck at basically no cost. I mean, the 3-mana... Also, here's the other thing I love about this cycle. I love that the lands deal damage to you, because I love trading life as a resource. So these are like tech checking so many boxes for me, where they're giving me modal cards, they're letting me pay life as a resource. They're not coming in tapped, which I loathe, which is what's keeping me from being over the moon about a lot of these other cards, is that tapped lands really bum me out. And on top of that, they let me embrace the like little bit of my Timmy side, which just occasionally likes to cast a giant spell, and it's just, I love it. I have not had such a strong emotional reaction to a card in a long time than that sort of white mythic. Let's actually look up the name for it.
Emeria the Shattered Skyclave. Emeria's Call.
Emeria's Call and Shattered Skyclave, are the ones we're talking about. So, yeah, that card...
I mean, I couldn't be more shocked.
I'm surprised you're shocked, but yeah, I mean, I get how I wouldn't like a 7-mana sorcery, but the whole point is it's not. It's a land that sometimes is a 7-mana sorcery. I think that one's also incredible on power level. Like, what do you think about it, Anthony?
I mean, I think it's obviously an extremely strong card, and you might say, like, well, it's just as a sorcerer would be a little bit underwhelming, but the flexibility is just unbelievable. And clearly they've also, like, by allowing it to come into play untapped to the cost is definitely not to try and make these more constructed viable compared to a lot of the commons that are more targeted at limited. But it doesn't spark joy for me in the same way it does for you.
Interesting. I had an experience, let's say, with Boon of the Wishgiver, which is that sorcery from Ikoria, which is just 6 mana, draw 4 cards, and it has cycling for generic mana. Which is that when it was first spoiled, I was like, I mean, I was considering every generic cycling 1 card because I do think that effect is very powerful, and I'm very high on cantrips, and I'm very happy to just put cyclers in my deck. But I was like, when is my control deck ever going to want to spend 6 mana at sorcery speed to not affect the board? Like, it seems like even if I have 6 mana, I would rather just cycle it and hold up counter magic or removal or whatever. I really thought it would basically never get cast. I think I even estimated at some point, like, just under 5% of the times in which you draw it are you going to be able to cast it. And the reality from playing with it is that you get to cast it way more than I thought. Just way, way more. It is so much more relevant than I thought it would be to have a 6 mana, draw 4 cards in your deck at the cost of not having to put a 6 mana, draw 4 cards in your deck. And so I think it's my extremely positive experience with that has me so excited about Emeria's Call. Emeria's Call. Because, you're going to get to cast a 7 mana sorcery in your, like, white aggro deck that has 14 lands sometimes. Like, that's just great. It's so good.
Could be better. Could make, 20 Pegasuses.
I will say, if I'm going to get really nitpicky, I'm a little bit annoyed the Angels don't have Vigilance. I mean, how much better would the card be if the Angels had Vigilance? Would it be that much better? Probably not that much better. And it would just mean I would have to have 1 less token for the cube, and it'd be like Sarah Angels. It would just be a little better if it was that. But what are you going to do?
This token space pollution is really what's going to bring Magic to its knees.
Token space pollution is a real problem for cube designers, Anthony.
Okay.
Anyway, I'm really excited about that card. I like the red one quite a bit as well. The blue one, which just got spoiled like an hour ago, I'm not quite as high on. I'm probably still going to be testing, but it doesn't spark the joy, and I'm not like over the moon about it. I actually kind of expected, I feel like recently in sets when we have like a splashy mythic cycle, I feel like the blue one is usually less powerful, which is probably important that it be less powerful because of blue's ability to abuse, broken mythics. But yeah, the blue one seems a little bit less exciting to me, and I'm really excited to see what the green and black ones have in store. These are just such exciting cards. But talking about these and the other modal double face cards in this set has been very interesting. So we compared them in our sort of bonus episode talking about the announcement of Zendikar Rising to mostly the cycling 1 cards, and our sort of justification was that like, if you are cycling this away to draw a land, and then you play that land for turn, then, you tapped 1 land, and you ended up with, a tapped land in play, and, up a card, which is what you would have been if you had just, played this as a tap land or whatever. So, in that sense, they are somewhat similar. It's also, like, a mechanic that it's easy to compare it to, because you can slap cycling on any spell, and you have to make the spell a little bit overcosted, just like you can slap a land on the back of any spell, but you have to make the spell a little overcosted. So, that was an interesting comparison. But I have a list here, Anthony, of other possible comparisons to these modal double face cards to try and like evaluate them, and I'm curious to talk through them with you and see where you come down on them. The first one is just man lands, right? The lands you can pay to turn into a creature. And I thought of this one specifically when one of the first modal double face cards that was spoiled was that blue 4/3 flyer for 5, right? Let's see, where is that?
Mr. Wave Rider.
It's Umara Wizard is what I'm thinking of. So it's a blue 4/3 that can be given flying when you cast an instant or sorcery or wizard spell for 5 mana, and then on the back it's a tapped land. And some people in the Cube community specifically are very high on this card and are like, this is incredible. It's like a bomb, that you wouldn't play this in every deck is a huge mistake. And I was like, I don't know. It doesn't seem great to me. And so I was just comparing this specifically to Celestial Colonnade, which is a very good mana land. And for a second, let's put aside the fact that Colonnade requires 2 colors of mana to activate, because that's obviously its own consideration. But here you can either have a tapped land that taps for blue, or late in the game you can have a 5 mana 4/3. And the people that are arguing that this is very good are basically making the argument that this spell is very close to free to put in your deck. You put it in a land slot. You're running a tapped land now, which is a cost, but we run tapped lands for other reasons. So like, we're happy to have our triomes in our deck or whatever. A lot of people still run just regular tapped lands for their dual lands. So we're happy to have tapped lands for a benefit, and the benefit of being able to cast your multicolored spells is worth it for many people. And here, the benefit of you draw this in a late game and it's just a guaranteed 4/3 with occasionally with flying is like very high value, and just the ability to occasionally have a 5 mana 4/3 when it's the right time to have it is just worth a lot. The reason I think it's so interesting to compare to Celestial Colonnade is because Celestial Colonnade is almost exactly the same, right? It's a tap land. It happens to also fix your mana, but we're putting that aside for now. And then you can pay 5 mana to turn it into a 4/4 with flying and vigilance, actually. So obviously this does not wear off. The Colonnade, you have to activate turn over turn if you want to keep activating it. That's a difference for sure. But just comparing Umara Wizard and Celestial Colonnade, I think Celestial Colonnade is the stronger card.
I think it's pretty close, but I actually might lean towards the Umara Wizard. Like, obviously, the Colonnade is a more powerful creature when you do cast it, but the fact that you do activate it, but the fact that you only have to pay for it once with the Wizard makes a huge difference.
Yeah, there's pros and cons, right? Like, in a big picture sense, the way the manlands work, which is, I think, a big advantage over the modal double face cards, is that you get both, right? You get the land, and then later on you get the creature. And here,
True.
If you are getting Umara Wizard later on, you also didn't have it in play as a land to tap for mana for the first few turns of the game or whatever. So that's a downside. But a big upside of the creature is that, it's just always a creature, like you said. You're paying 5 mana for a 4/3, you always have that. Obviously, that has pros and cons too. Like, one of the cool advantages of manlands is that they can often dodge sorcery speed removal or board wipes or anything, because you can turn them on and off when you need to. But yeah, I think it's really close to compare those two cards. And it's worth noting that we're talking about like an uncommon mono blue card versus a rare dual land. So the fact that this is in contention and it's like a discussion we're having, I think is a testament to how powerful the mechanic is. But I'm not running Celestial Colonnade in my cube, and I don't think I'm going to test Umara Wizard either. I don't think it's impactful enough to be worth the tapped land and all the sort of other costs surrounding it. I find myself revisiting all of these other value lands, though, now that I'm looking at the modal double face cards in this light. So, for example, I actually tweeted out on the Lucky Paper Twitter account when this first was spoiled on Tuesday or whatever, that I was convinced that this set was going to be the set that got me to finally put Lonely Sandbar in my cube, right? Which is just the tapped blue land you can cycle for blue. And I think it is going to work. I think I am going to put it in. And the reason why is that Lonely Sandbar I've always thought of as a land, right? Like, it's a land, and the value it has is that it's a land that if you draw it late, you can just cycle it and, get some more action. And I think what will change it for me is instead framing it as a spell and assuming that in the vast majority of games I'm going to cycle it unless I desperately need a land, in which case I can always just play it tapped as a blue source. And that makes it much more appealing to me to just assume this is one blue mana draw card, and if you really need to, you can put it in play as a tap land as like a last resort. That framing and thinking about it in deck construction as, not contributing to my land count, for example, I think makes the card much more appealing. And if you had printed, a modal double face card that was functionally the same as, Lonely Sandbar and just said 1 mana draw card, and then the backside was just come in to play tap for blue, that card would seem quite good to me. And so the fact that I have not tested Lonely Sandbar seems like an indictment of my evaluation of that card.
That's fair, but with the Umara Wizard, you're always getting an actual spell out of it, even if it's not a great spell, whereas when you cycle Lonely Sandbar, it's, maybe now it's 40% of a land instead of a whole land. So I think that comparison is really difficult to make.
Yeah, it was the first comparison we made because I think it was, it's close in our memory because Ikoria was just a set we dealt with, and there's a lot of people that were kind of reckoning with the idea of running overcosted, inefficient spells in their cube because of the cycling mode being available on it. So it is interesting because it's another mechanic that will get you to play an overcosted, inefficient spell, but Yeah, I think you're right. Mechanically, they're not actually that similar because, a cycling spell draws you lands and spells at the density of whatever lands and spells you included in your deck, as opposed to this, which always gives you the choice. You always have a creature or you always have a land. You're not taking any of that risk of saying, like, I'm going to keep a one-lander with my generic cycling card and hope to cycle into a land. Like, you can just say, well, I'll keep this one-lander because it's actually a two-lander because I have this Multiple Double Face card, which is a guaranteed land if I want it, and doesn't get Thoughtseized away.
What if we take another extreme to this and say, well, what if you just played a constructed deck of only these cards? So you've got, your 4 of your wizard, you got your 4 of your whatever this beautiful beast rider is. And we just say, well, all your lands are coming into play tapped. You're playing a turn behind. But if you never want to draw your 5th land, you don't have to. You can just...
You are literally never mana screwed, and you are literally never mana flooded. And for that cost, for that benefit, you are paying by having tapped lands and having below rate spells. And how worth it is it?
It seems pretty good.
There were some people that speculated when this mechanic was first spoiled that felt like it was as broken as Companion, and that's what we were going to see. We were going to see decks where nobody was running any lands anymore. They were just running modal double face cards and basically like completely... that was why I think it drew the comparison to Companion, because taken to its extreme, it does fundamentally change the game of Magic in that it removes a lot of variance that is always present, right? In the same way that always having a card in your opening hand, fundamentally changed the game of Magic in sort of a very profound way. I think in reality, if you're talking about standard or whatever, even if you're talking about like just block constructed, let's just play constructed with just this set, I think the cards are all going to be enough worse that... And you're playing a whole turn off tempo by playing almost all of your lands tapped. We do have the Mythic Cycle, which you can have come in untapped at the cost of some life. But playing all of your lands tapped, is a real cost. The same way that, like, I really like cantrips, but obviously you can't just fill a deck with nothing but cantrips, right? Like, that deck will also never get mana flooded or mana screwed, but you also won't do anything. You'll spend all your time just cycling your cards to make sure you can play lands. So it's a funny extreme. And the fact that we have this new spectrum now where, like, that is a theoretical extreme you could be on. You could have a deck that never gets mana screwed and always has exactly as many lands as it wants, is a new change to the game.
So it sounds like you're definitely all in on the Emeria's Call. Are there any others that you're actually considering putting into your cube?
Oh, yeah, there's a lot I'm considering. I think Emeria's Call is kind of a slam dunk for me. I think the Shatter Skull Smashing, the red mythic, is also just kind of a slam dunk. Like, I'm going to put that in my cube, and I don't expect it to be taken out anytime soon. The other ones I'm interested in the green Regrowth, and forgive me, I'm not going to know all these card names at this point. I'm sorry, people, but there's a 3-mana Regrowth that you can also play as a tapped green land. There is, we'll talk about the Mana Dork in a second. That one to me is one of the most interesting modal double face cards, because both sides just do exactly the same thing, and it's just, do you want it to be a land or do you want it to be a 2-mana 1/1? So actually, that one I'm not that high on. I'm interested in possibly this white removal spell that deals damage to any target equal to the number of creatures you control. Kabira something or other.
So that one isn't as good. Oh, never mind. I thought that one specifically said was counting the number of creatures in your party, but I must be mixing it up.
Yeah, it's actually weird that it doesn't, but it just cares about the number of creatures you control total. We're talking about Kabira Takedown now, which is a 2-mana instant that deals damage equal to the number of creatures you control to target creature or planeswalker. That one I'm on the fence about because, I think that effect is great, stable to a land, but that effect is going to be an effect that aggressive decks want the most, mid-range decks are pretty happy with, and control decks don't really want. And that's also like an inverse relationship to the decks that are willing to play a tapped land. So I would not be happy to put that in my aggro deck in a land slot, I don't think, because aggro decks I just really don't want to tap land ever. So there I'd expect to be running it effectively in a spell slot, at which point it's like a spell slot that mitigates a little bit of mana screw. If you really need to play it as land, you can, but I don't think it earns a spell slot on its sort of face and just what the card does in your average aggro deck. So that one I'm a little on the fence about, but I'm considering. There were a couple others. I mean, I think that this is similar to Cycling 1, where like I'm looking at every card that has it written on it and expecting that there's a very good chance the card is very playable, because if you just assume it's a land and you can afford to play a land in your deck that comes into play tapped, then you get to have this late game value and this sort of additional choice all the time. There's a couple other precedents for these cards which I thought were interesting that I was thinking about this week. So we talked about mana lands, talked about Cycling 1. The castles are a pretty interesting comparison, specifically to this new Mythic Cycle we have here, because they have the option of also coming in untapped if you control a basic land of the appropriate color. What do you think of the castles?
These are the rare lands from Throne of Eldraine?
Yes, so Castle Ardenvale, Castle Embereth, Garenbrig, Loch Dwayne, etc., Vantress. One in each color. They all have an activated ability that does something relevant in the late game and produce colored mana, like this Mythic Cycle does, and could possibly come in untapped if you are, deep into color. How do you think these compare to the double face cards?
I think that's a valuable comparison. I think these seem a little bit stronger. Like, the castles are really easy to just put in any deck because, like you said, there's very little cost because they can usually come into play untapped and just give you some options late game.
Well, I don't know if I would say usually. It really depends on your deck and what your mana base looks like. Specifically, if you're in like a 2-color deck, you are hoping to play dual lands earlier to like open up your options of casting more spells, on time. So it's entirely possible that you would have this as your third land or whatever and just not have the correct basic yet. So it's like 50-50. I don't know. We could do some math on that and figure out how likely you were to get that. But I would expect, my anticipation would be like half the time they come in untapped.
But I think the thing that changes this is when we take this this mechanic to the extreme and imagine, like, if you're playing a deck that just doesn't ever have to draw too many lands, it seems sort of game-altering in a way that the castles are not.
Well, I mean, to like draw a comparison, in theory, you could run nothing but castles in your deck. I mean, you actually wouldn't have quite enough to make a constructed deck because there's not enough of them. But, you could build 5-color castles and, in the same way, you would never get mana screwed. And you could just have mana to activate all of these abilities all the time and make human creature tokens and do all this stuff. Obviously...
Well, yeah, but all the stuff is scry a bunch, draw some cards and lose some life, and have mana that you can only spend on creatures. It's not, except for the white one that actually makes tokens, I don't think it's actually a win condition.
Right, which is something I was going to mention, is that the castles are arguably better because you do get the land and the effect, which you don't get with the modal double face cards. You only get one or the other. But these effects are all pretty marginal, and they're costed appropriately, right? Like, I mean, if you're sticking an activated ability on a land that already taps for colored mana, it's going to have to be significantly overcosted. Here we're looking at 4 mana for a 1/1, or 3 mana for a temporary, boost everyone's power, or 3 mana to draw a card and lose some life, or 4 mana to scry 2. These are all very, like, incremental effects. None of them are going to be, like, game-changing. And to your point, you can't build a whole deck full. I mean, you could imagine building a deck full of, like, castles and manlands and nothing but lands that have all these activated abilities, and you could theoretically... Again, like, so it's not actually... I mean, now that we're, like, breaking it down, it's not actually that the idea of having a deck where you never get mana screwed or mana flooded is actually new, right? It's just we're seeing it in a new context with the way these cards are put, and this technology of modal double-face cards. But you could already build a deck with nothing but lands that had activated abilities that could theoretically have lots of win conditions and whatever, but it's just all of those things are overcosted enough that it's not worth it, which I think is probably the case with the modal double face cards too, though they don't seem as overcosted as all these abilities on lands seem to me to be, partially because these are all repeatable and the spells are obviously one-off, and also you don't get both, which is relevant. You got to choose. Here, the sort of comparison of the castles is interesting in a couple specific places, like, Castle Ardenvale makes a 1/1 for 4 mana, as opposed to the, the white mythic, which makes 2 4/4s for 7 mana. Obviously, a much bigger effect on the game.
Pretty different.
A very big difference in sort of total impact on the game. It's not this marginal impact; it's a very big impact.
Man, the worst thing about the Angels is I know I'm going to draft it exactly one time, and I'm going to draw it when I have 6 lands in play, and I'm just going to be sitting there thinking, well, I could play this as my 7th land, but
it is going to open some interesting design. It's going to open some interesting decision points like that. And I mean, in that situation, unless you have other 7-drops in your deck, I think you probably just hold on to it.
Right.
But, you're going to draw it when you have 5 lands, and you do have 6 drops in your deck or whatever, and you have to be like, well, geez, what do I do? I mean, at that point, I guess you just hold it until you draw a 6-drop, and then you play your 6th land and play it. Maybe it's not actually that many interesting decision points that come up there. But, yeah, it's going to be a thing. It's going to be interesting. One of the closest comparisons, I think, like direct comparisons to the spell lands, is actually the Memorial cycle from Dominaria. So that's a cycle of uncommon lands, again, one of each color, that comes into play tapped, taps for a color, but has a one-time activated ability that requires you to sacrifice the card. So that's unlike the castles, which are repeatable and very marginal effects. These effects are, one-time and a little more impactful. So their costing is a little more efficient. Specifically here, I thought it was interesting to compare Memorial to Unity. I'm sorry, Memorial to Genius, which is the blue one. Do you know off the top of your
Genius.
head? It would make sense that it would be Genius. Memorial to Genius, which comes into play tap, produces a blue, and then you can pay 4 and a blue and tap and sacrifice it to draw 2 cards. Comparing that to the blue mythic that was just spoiled today, which is either 7 mana sorcery to draw cards equal to the number of cards in your hand plus 1, or a land that comes into play tapped unless you pay 3 life that produces blue. These are pretty similar to me in a lot of ways. So we're looking at, Memorial to Genius, again, like the man lands and castles and stuff, you get both. You get to play a land early on, tap it for mana, and then later on when you run out of stuff to do, you can pay 5 mana, which is actually 6 mana because you're tapping the Memorial too, so it's really kind of like effectively 6 mana to draw 2. Here, you either get a land or you get 7 mana, draw up some number of cards. Bare minimum, 1 if you're hellbent and draw this card. If that's gonna feel bad, people are gonna have to do that though. You're gonna draw Seagate Restoration when you are hellbent and just pay 7 mana to draw a single card. It's gonna happen.
Yeah, it's a very weird design. I don't know. I don't think I'm interested in it, to be honest.
I think it's a lot worse than the red and white one. For that reason I just said, honestly, like I don't really want to have a lot of cards in my hand at the point in the game where I can cast 7 mana spells. If I do, I feel like something has gone a little bit wrong, or I'm really significantly winning because I haven't had to use my cards to stay ahead. So or to like keep a parity. So yeah, this one is not as interesting to me, and I feel like between this and Memorial to Genius, would I maybe rather have Memorial to Genius? Possibly. It's not completely out of the question. Another important point about the man lands and the memorial lands is that they are significantly worse top decks because they both come into play tapped. So like Celestial Colonnade is a creature, but you can't play it and then activate it and block the next turn, right? Because it comes into play tapped. So they're quite slow if you're playing late in the game, where obviously the spells just happen immediately. So there's a lot of like interesting little like knobs that are being turned here to try and balance these and make them make sense in comparison to other lands that have additional late game value. The deserts are another set of recent-ish lands that have this kind of value associated with them. So they're really similar, I think, to the... I keep typing desert. Not desert. I mean desert, not desert.
One day we'll get desert lands.
Yeah, there's a lot of different deserts, actually, between Amonkhet and Hour of Devastation, but the ones specifically I'm talking about are, again, the uncommon cycle from Hour of Devastation that also sacrifice either themselves or another desert to give you some value. And these ones, instead of coming into play tapped unless you pay 3 life, like the mythics from this new set, tapped for a generic mana or tapped for a colorless mana rather, unless you paid a life to tap for the color of the appropriate kind. So obviously the one that really stands out here is Ramanap Ruins was so good it had to be banned in Standard, and that was just a land that either tapped for red and did damage to you, or a colorless mana, or you could pay 4 and sacrifice a desert to have it deal 2 damage to each opponent. How do you compare that to like one of these little double face cards, these like deserts that sacrifice themselves?
Again, I think it's a pretty fair comparison. I think that maybe the difference is that, like, I think the red one that deals damage, Ramunap Ruins, is maybe the best comparison, because it's actually a proactive card. Like, it deals damage to your opponent, it'll get him dead. And a lot of these spells that are tacked to lands here are proactive spells. It's not just, okay, I'll be able to draw an extra card next turn by cycling this land. It's actually putting creatures into play.
And, what those utility lands let you do is run more lands in your aggro deck because you are less worried about getting flooded, because if you get flooded, you just turn your lands into, shocks to your opponent's face, which was very much the strategy of that particular Standard deck. So, yeah, I mean, we saw Ramanap Ruins get banned, right? That card was really, really good and constructed. And does it have a place in Cube? This brings up an interesting question, which has been sort of cropping up around the discussion about these modal double face cards. Some people feel that these cards are not worth the slot in their cube, which is people have been saying that. I don't know exactly what it means. I imagine different people would mean different things when they say it, but what I'm gathering from people is that if you expect mostly to play it as a land that has some like marginal upside, right? Like, I love that white spell, but even if we're being optimistic, let's say that you get to cast the 7 mana side, 10% of the time you draw it, right? It is still 90% of the time just a land that, maybe deals 3 to you. So I think there's a lot of people that like the idea of playing what is kind of just a utility land that happens to be dressed up like a fancy double-face card sorcery is not very appealing. It feels like it's a waste of a slot in their cube where they could have given that to an interesting, powerful effect, and instead they gave it to just a land that has some marginal upside sometimes. And
right,
I don't know if
it's taking up that space to only actually be used maybe not even every draft.
Yeah, I think that is the sort of criticism of these cards. Some people that aren't running them just feel like, yeah, you're wasting a precious slot in the cube. You only get to choose 360 or however big your cube is of these cards that you're going to get to draft, and this is one less slot you have now available for a powerful finisher or whatever else you wanted to put in the cube. And I don't subscribe to that perspective, because to me, like, this is a powerful finisher. It's a powerful finisher if it has the huge advantage of being able to be played as a land, and I don't, kind of see it as a downside. But when I look at Ramanap Ruins, I can more understand why people might feel that way, because it's like, well, this is just basically like any red deck will play this very happily, right? Like, I'll jam at my red deck, but like, am I going to take it highly? No. Is it going to pull me into red? No. Is it like flexible? No. It just like does this thing, which is, maybe a case for considering those lands a little bit differently. I happen to think that like Ramanap Ruins is just it's the most powerful of the Desert Cycle from Hour Devastation. Though I want to give a shout out to Ifnir Deadlands, which I don't think people are giving enough respect. That is the black one, which you can pay 4 mana and sacrifice it to put 2 -1/-1 counters on a creature at sorcery speed.
That was definitely the best one in Limited for sure.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that one is probably pretty respectable here. Like, again, if we imagine this as a modal double-face card where the front end is a 4-mana sorcery that puts 2 -1/-1 counters on a creature, and the back is a tapped black land that, you can pay 3 to untap. The card sounds okay. So, like, I feel like if your Deadlands is not too far behind. But it just happens that, like, these cards are pretty narrow in their effect, even though they are flexible in the fact that they are both lands and, spell-like effects. Whereas the fact that these other cards have such a big impact on the game, they're splashy mythics that do something like really substantial, just means that they have more flexibility, right? Like, I guess the best way to put it is I would not put Ramanap Ruins in like a blue-red control deck, probably, because the life loss is going to be somewhat significant over the course of the game, and the chances that my blue-red control deck is going to lose, unless I deal exactly 2 more damage to them, right now, is so slim, right? Like, the way that deck wins is by taking some damage early and then, stabilizing and then turning the corner and winning with a lot of card advantage and, board presence and just kind of overwhelming their opponent. So it's not likely to be in a situation where they're like, you're in a tight race back and forth with your opponent, or, you're, kind of at parity and sitting in a board stall. Like, those things are just not likely to happen where you want this, like, reach from a land. So it's really just kind of an aggro card. On the flip side, I will very happily put that 7-mana sorcery in my aggro deck, because it feels like it is less of a cost of inclusion, because aggro doesn't care as much about life loss as control does. And, I feel like the games where you get to 7 mana with an aggro deck, which are definitely the non-ideal games, you're getting flooded if you're at 7 mana with your aggro deck. I still feel like that happens way more often than the games where the 2 damage from Ramanap Ruins actually is the difference maker in a win or loss when you're in some control deck.
So my question then is, if you're putting it in your aggressive deck, is it taking a land slot or a spell slot? Because if you're saying 7 mana, recover from a game that you basically had lost, you really need to draw 8 lands to make it work.
Yeah, you do. Which, I mean, it happens, right? Like,
yeah, it does.
I wish it didn't, but it does definitely happen sometimes. And, some aggro decks end up with Skull Clamp, and you just draw half your deck, but it doesn't matter because you just keep drawing a bunch of little tiny aggro creatures, and your opponent's on like green mid-range, and they have a bunch of like planeswalkers or whatever. And like in that situation, I want to be able to draw into my 7 or 8 mana sorcery that just puts 2 4/4 flyers into play, because that will actually get me out of that situation. So yeah, I don't know. It's funny. I am definitely reevaluating all of these old utility lands now that I am basically imagining, how would I evaluate this differently if I just thought of it as a modal double-face card instead of a utility land? Because Why are you saying wow like that?
I said wow. Look at the way this has created a new thought technology.
Well, it does. It is an important thought technology. We talked about Barbarian Ring on this podcast before, Anthony. Do you have cards I think I might have asked you when we talked about it, but do you have cards that are in this sort of category of cards that you would like to put in your cube decks but don't feel like you can fit in your cube itself?
I don't really feel that way too strongly. I mean, if anything, similar like utility lands that are in monocolor, that I've actually included some in the past and ended up cutting them. But I think there are ways to mitigate that. Like, if you still want to be able to include more lands in your cube, you could just say, like, well, let's just draft 18 card packs and just include a whole bunch of these. Like, I think there are ways to solve it. So it's not something that I feel like too much pressure against.
I've seen more and more people doing 16 card packs lately. It seems like that is kind of spreading a bit.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. I don't know. I mean, 3 extra cards in your pool is a big difference, I think, at the end of the day. All right, what Spoiler Smith Week are you most excited about, Anthony? If I've not bored you enough with... Oh, I'm sorry. One last thing on the modal double-face cards. There is...
Do you want to talk about this little green guy?
2 things left on
3
modal
things
double-face
left.
cards.
I have one more thing.
There is one card which has been printed in the past, which is almost exactly a modal double-face card. It just was printed with different technology. And this is the card Rustic Claken? Do you know this card, Anthony?
No. What is a Claken?
I'm sure I'm pronouncing it wrong. I think that word means like small town or farm or something. It is from Morningtide, and it is a white-producing land that comes into play tapped unless you reveal a Kithkin from your hand. And this land has Reinforce 1. And what Reinforce 1 is you can pay 1 and a white and discard it to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. So that's just a modal double-face card right there. It's a land that sometimes comes into play tapped, sometimes doesn't, or it's a 2-mana, put a +1/+1 counter on a creature at instant speed, which is, I don't know, like, that's a thing. So, like, that card, maybe.
But you have to have a Kithkin in your hand.
To have it come into play untapped, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you can cast it or whatever, or play it as land. You just can't... Isn't there a modal double-face card that is very similar to that effect that we saw? Let me see here. That's Kabira Takedown.
So one of the ones, are you maybe thinking of the McKindy Stampede, which is an overrun, sorcery speed overrun, or a tapped planes?
I could be thinking about that. What do you think of the McKindy Stampede?
So these are the 2. I'll just be upfront. Like, I did not, and probably still don't expect to put any of these in my own cube. But the 2 that are the most tempting are the McKindy Stampede and the Bala Ged Recovery. I really like both of these because they are effects that are relevant late in the game specifically. So if you draw it early, it's a land. If you draw it late, you get some good value out of it. And even more, like, I think that this kind of like overrun effect in white is pretty powerful in my lower powered cube environment, but I think if I just put like the instant speed, all creatures get +2/+1, people would just not draft it because it is a little bit high in variance because sometimes it just doesn't do anything. So these are the 2 that are most tempting to me. Another thing that occurred to me that I think is pretty interesting is I also have the bounce lands in my cube. So the idea of playing this early, playing a bounce land, picking it up, and then being able to cast it actually adds some like interesting lines to the games, especially even if you have a card like Knight of the Reliquary. Now you can go fetch up your bounce land specifically so you can pick up and reactivate one of these cards.
You can fetch up your 7-mana sorcery that makes 4 angels.
I mean, this is the kind of gameplay that you love, right?
You can fetch it up, and then you can sacrifice another land and then go get your bounce land to put the thing back in your hand. It's just a,
Just never stop.
Self-contained,
Get that value.
self-contained little combo. It's funny, I originally thought, when we saw this mechanic, like earlier this week, that I would be most excited about those situational cards like you described, because, to your point, an overrun as a card alone, while oftentimes game-winning, is also sometimes a totally dead card, and so it is oftentimes not an appealing pick. But this really highlights how much different this mechanic is than just cycling is to me, because as these cards have come out, I actually have found myself much more excited about like the generically powerful cards that just always do something, right? As opposed to the situational ones, because cycling, you're just saying like, give me another pacifist. Like, I don't want this now. Like you're deciding kind of in the context of the game, do I want to replace this with a new card, or do I want to cast this card? And here, you're never replacing it with a new card. You can always have a land. So it's like, the difference is like, you could still be like late game top decking and have no creatures in play, and then you draw this like McKindy Stampede, and you're like, well, I wish this was actually just had cycling, because now I just want to draw another card because this is still dead to me. And the I don't know, it feels very different to me because of the fact that you have this guaranteed effect. The fact that it's guaranteed makes me want not situational cards and instead just want whatever generic stuff. Like I'm closer to liking the 4/3 for 5 than I am to liking the McKindy Stampede, I think.
Because it is still, like, a situational card on both sides, and there could be late-game moments where you both have an empty board and you don't need more lands, and it still can be a dead card.
Yeah, the one specifically I'm thinking about that I was considering for my own cube when it was spoiled is Sajiri's Shelter, which is either a tapped white land or an instant that gives a creature protection from the color of your choice till end of turn for 2 mana, for 1 and a white, which is a perfect example of, like, that effect is very situational. Oftentimes it is irrelevant, but when it is relevant, it can have an incredibly high ceiling. It can be 2 mana win the game because you make your creature unblockable. It can be 2 mana fizzle their big removal spell. It can be 2 mana, eat a creature in combat. It can be a lot of different things for a very small mana investment. But the more I looked at it, the more I was like, what deck wants this? Like, I would want this effect again in like an aggro or mid-range deck, and I don't know. It's like when the decision point is if this spell is not relevant to me, let's say I have no board, or my opponent is not playing some strategy where protection is going to matter, right? They're playing like just a mono black control with board wipes and -1/-1 or something, and not like targeted removal. Then what am I going to do? Just like now I have an extra land and I'm happy? Like, no, I'm not happy to have an extra land if I don't want land, right? Like what I want is another card, and I still am stuck with either a situational card or a card that doesn't do anything. I mean, a land might not be what I need at that point. So I guess it's like in the early game, if you need a land, you can always play these as lands, and I expect some of them will be most often played as lands and put in land slots. And then in the late game, I just still don't want situational cards that do nothing. Like if this is Tajiri Shelter, which is a card that was 1 and a white, give a creature protection, or cycle for generic mana, I think it'd be a much better card than it is right now, where it can either be a land or this shelter.
Yeah, I think I agree, and I think that this card in particular, the others that I mentioned are appealing because you draw them late in the game and they are relevant, and early in the game, you just say like, well, it's turn 1, I'm going to play my tap land wherever it least detrimentally affects my ability to just cast my spells out. Whereas what I would want to do with Tajiri Shelter is say like, I'm going to plan to use this proactively if my opponent tries to interfere during combat on my turn.
Right.
And keep it up until I need another land drop and then just play it out. But because it comes into play tapped, you don't necessarily actually have that flexibility.
Right.
So I think that creates kind of an awkward tension, which puts me off of it a bit.
Yeah, meanwhile, like holding this up for a little while until it becomes more advantageous to cycle it and draw into another card and like try and find more action or try and find whatever you need, like that would feel like a thing where it was actually giving me choices. I don't actually feel like I have as many choices with Sheltered, being that I just have to play it as a tapped land or save this sort of protection spell, which it's funny, like, for all the comparisons we've drawn, like I still don't really know how to evaluate this. I'm having trouble like articulating why I think it's different than other modal cards, but that shelter, that Tajiri Shelter is never anything but a land or a protection spell, right? A card recycling could be anything, and that's part of the power of a card recycling. The last one I want to talk about, Anthony, is Tangled Florahedron.
This card is so weird.
It's so
cute,
in terms of
what it's adorable. I spent a lot of time looking at this, both because it's adorable, both the illustration on both sides is great, but also it's just like, so one side is a tapped green land, the other side is a mana dork, so it's a 2 mana 1/1 that taps for green, and that's so confusing.
Well, it is kind
because
of mind.
if you don't have your third land, you just always play this as a land, and it makes no difference, except now it's not a creature, so it's like, in most cases, it's probably better to have a land than a creature, right? So it just makes you think about, is this trade-off of spending more mana to have 4 mana on turn 3 actually worth doing, versus just playing it as a land?
Yeah, what it really...
or value? What do you want?
What it really does in a sort of kind of concise package is, I think, highlight why mana dorks, as they get more expensive, get like exponentially less valuable. Because a turn 1 mana dork, like a 1 CMC mana dork played very early in the game, you are all but guaranteed to have your next land drop unless something went horribly wrong or you took a really greedy hand. So like if you're playing a Llanowar Elf on turn 1, you are going to have 3 mana on turn 2 unless they bolt your bird, right? As soon as you go to 2 mana, it's like, all right, well, now I got to get to 2 mana, and then I also have to have my third land drop. And, the chances of hitting your third land drop are significantly less than hitting your second land drop, and those chances just continue to go down until, the chances of hitting your 6th land drop on time are, like, all but impossible, right? Like, only if you're flooding out, basically. Like, it is very rare to hit your 6th land drop on turn 6. So what this is really highlighting is just what you said, right? Like, the fact that both sides of this card do the exact same thing, you can either pay 2 mana so it doesn't count as a land drop for the turn and is fragile to removal, or you can just play it as a land, is kind of, it's like a weird, it's like psyching me out. It's
yeah.
Like, I feel like there should be a right answer, and it's just like looking at me and like, yeah, we both do the same thing. Like, what are you going to do? Which one are you going to choose?
I mean, so what if this card was just written differently and it was ETB tapped land, but it had an ability that just said, pay 2 mana, put me into play? I think I would like that more, I think.
Yeah, for sure, because it'd be, it's 2 mana, it's like a rampant growth, basically, instead of a 2 mana 1/1 that taps for green. And rampant growth is a lot better than a 1/1 that taps for green because of the aforementioned removal situation. So that would be better, I think, but it wouldn't be that much better. And it again highlights how strange and weird this card is, because it just, it does the same thing on both sides.
Why? Same thing. Both sides.
Same ding-dang thing. This is another one that I don't think is very good, and it's because the sides are so similar and they're so close in cost. I mean, 0 mana versus 2 mana is not a huge difference, certainly compared to 0 mana versus 7 mana with all the other mythics we've been talking about. It highlights why I don't think, like, okay, let's just, like, again, draw this comparison. If this was a 2 mana 1/1 that tapped for green and had cycling generic mana, slam dunk, I am all about that, 100%.
Totally.
Like, that card seems great because I really want it early in the game and I really don't want to draw it late. And so when I do draw it late, I just cycle it away and I draw something else. And this is not as good to me because here it's like, if I have my first 2 lands and I'm presented on turn 2 with the possibility of casting this, I either have a 4-drop, end my 3rd land, in which case I definitely cast it, or I don't have my 3rd land, in which case I just play it out as a land. And either way, like, it's a very, very, very marginal upside on a 2 mana 1/1 that taps for green, which is that, you know, if you're get stuck on lands, you can keep like, you know, 1 in every 100 hands you otherwise couldn't keep, because now this is a tap land on turn 1, whereas before you would have been keeping a 1-lander. Now you're keeping a 2-lander, you know, which is a little better. But that upside is very marginal, I think. And I'm not very high on a 2 mana 1/1 that just taps for green in my own environment.
So this was the card that made me, the first one I saw that I was like, okay, I might actually put some of these double face cards in my cube. But after thinking about it more, and I can't say I wasn't influenced by the adorable picture.
It's very adorable.
But after thinking about it more, even though it, like, in my environment, I do support a 2 mana dork, and they still are pretty good. And this seemed like it just gives you a little bit more flexibility than that. But it doesn't give you the same kind of flexibility as some of the other cards we talked about, where they have, like, flexibility that they do things early and late in the game. It just sort of gives you flexibility in how your hand plays out, but in a way that's actually pretty prescriptive. So yeah, I think I'm actually not that excited about it.
Yeah. It's weird. I'm still having trouble, like, articulating it perfectly.
Why is it so weird?
Well, I mean, it's not to, like, you know, talk about how great Magic is, but, you know, it's amazing to me that you and I have been playing Magic for 5 years now or whatever, and thinking about it with far too much of our waking hours and spending a lot of time talking about it and, like, you know, just occupying a lot of our sort of mental space. And yet they come out with a new mechanic that is, like, so marginally different than a couple of other pre-existing mechanics, all the ones we reviewed. But I still don't know how to evaluate it or how to articulate what's different about it. Like, this is so much different than Cycling 1, so much more different than I thought it was, that it's, like, kind of weird. And it's also so much more different than having utility lands in your deck that it's hard for me to process. But yeah, this is a good sort of tidy case study for why I think many of these cards are much worse than they would be if they just had Cycling 1 attached to them. Whereas some of them I think were a lot better than if they had Cycling 1. Like, I'm trying to think if I would be excited about, you know, the 7 mana white card that had Cycling 1 instead. And there I'm not as excited about it, because there I'm basically saying I'm almost never going to cast this card, so I'm just basically taxing my draw step at that point and saying I have to, like, you know, dig a little bit deeper to find that land.
What if it had cycling pay 3 life?
Ooh, I'm into it then. Sign me up. Cycling pay 3 life sounds really good. And that's actually, you know, that's a good point. It is kind of like that because, you know, it doesn't come into play tapped if you pay 3 life. So, but yeah, it's like there, you know, I like that particular effect has land on the back, because that's what I want most of the time. And that's what allows me to justify putting it in a full-on land slot. Whereas I'm not going to put a generic cycler in a full-on land slot. I will, you know, once I have 3 generic cyclers or 1 mana cantrips, I will shave a land, and I'll continue to do that as I get more. But, you know, that's only worth a third of a land, whereas this is worth a full land in my deck, 100%. Like, Amiria's Call is a land in my deck, and sometimes it will have this insane upside. So it's like, it's the way that I'm evaluating these effects with lands on the back is just way different than I expected. And I'm sure it's going to be way different when I start playing with them and casting them and realizing how they actually play out.
It's definitely going to be an interesting new twist of just trying to figure out how do you actually build your mana base in this format. I guess not, because we don't actually get to lay out our cards in paper anymore, but we can dream.
I'm buying a box. we're gonna
all right, let's do it. Let's play some sealed.
We'll be doing some sealed.
Well,
right,
Tangled Florahedron, you are wonderful. I look forward to playing you in Limited, but that is it.
Yeah, it's cute. Yeah, I mean, it'd be totally fine in your cube. Like, it would be viable, and I think.
Oh, it would be fine. So I have a bigger concern about these flip cards, which is just the like legibility of them. So I think it's going to be not an issue at all in Limited, because, you know, the set has a couple mechanics. You're going to be aware that this is there. You'll look for it. But I think if I put just like a Riverside Pathway or this Tangled Florahedron in my cube, and it was like one of 1 to 5 instances of this mechanic, I think a new drafter would just completely miss this little tiny symbol in the bottom left and not understand the actual value of the card. So for that reason, I just feel like the small amount of flexibility it adds over another 2-mana dork is just not worth that extra complexity for me. Specifically that like comprehension complexity. Is that a thing?
No, for sure. I mean, I think in my cube, I have come to kind of enjoy the fact that it's like a little bit of a museum of so many different kinds of effects that cards have, but it is 100% more intimidating and difficult to parse for somebody coming to the cube for the first time. I mean, God forbid if they're like newer to Magic and haven't seen these effects before ever because they started playing after the effect was printed, like that makes it much harder. And so it's definitely a cost. Yeah. I mean, we happen to play with mostly experienced players, so like I'm not as worried about that, but I totally get people that want to avoid I don't want to have a single double-face card in my cube because it's, just a headache. Some people really just don't like double-face cards at all because it requires people to like pull cards out of sleeves and,
just the logistics of it.
Yeah,
so, and to be clear, I don't think it's actually an issue. Like, I think if I put, one of the, like, flip lands, which I think are maybe the most difficult to parse, the pathways, I think that it would come up almost never that someone would actually be confused and understand it. But thinking about the player that is completely new, has never seen this before, I think it's still worth considering because it does add a little bit of cognitive load even to the more experienced players. So I always want to place a pretty high bar on what totally new things that are adding more complexity are doing, and if they're actually adding something positive to the environment.
Yeah, that's a classic lesson from. You and I work in user experience design, which is not so different from game design. And one of the drums we're always beating is that if it's better for like less enfranchised or less invested people, then it's also better for people even that are super invested, right? So the main audience you'd be worried about with like putting a bunch of various effects in your cube is people that would get intimidated by it or didn't know the sort of rules of those effects. But it's also just better for experienced players where they don't have to like look at the board state and go, okay, now how did that work again? And it's just like a little more load, even if you are very familiar with the cards. So yeah, a very serious concern.
That's how we get OXO Good Grips, and now my kitchen drawer looks like a big box of dildos.
Oh, don't get me started on OXO, Anthony. I wouldn't be so mad at OXO if so many people didn't love it so much,
I mean, they're exactly the use case that you're describing, though.
What do you mean?
That when they designed their products, they said, well, we're not going to design for your mean target audience. We're going to design for the people that are at the extremes.
I think that's how it started, but now I just think they make everything all bulbous and rubber, and they don't care.
Yeah, I'm not crazy about it.
I'm not either. What I want my utensils in my kitchen to do is look distinct and feel distinct, Like, I don't want my interface with all utensils to be completely catered to my hands because just because they're like, oh, this is the shape of most human hands. So, like, no matter what you're touching, whether it's a bicycle or a kitchen knife or a computer mouse, it all feels the same. I want them all to feel different. I want them to have, like, a uniqueness to them, a personality.
Just like your Magic cards.
Just like my Magic cards. All right, that's going to do it for this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. I want to thank DJ James Nasty for producing our music on our podcast. It's great, and you should check him out on the internet by Googling DJ James Nasty. And Anthony, I think we have a special crack-a-pack to end this episode, right? Based on what we teased last episode?
Oh, yeah, let's crack this pack.
And we're just, it's a collector's booster, right?
This is a Theros Beyond Death collector's booster, and I mostly
now,
just wanted to give
keep all these products straight. Which one is collector's boosters again? That's the one that's a full booster that has like a bunch of extra rares and foils and uncommons and stuff?
These are wild. So it's a full booster, but there's like just all foils and 4 rares and who knows what's going on.
It's not the ones... What are the ones that only have like 4 cards in them? What are those?
Those are promo packs,
okay,
I think.
Good. We got a full booster, though. So, crack it for us, Anthony. Let's
right.
see what you get. Now, what is the thing you most want to open in this pack right now, Anthony? What are you hoping to see?
Theros Beyond Death. Was that Oko? I think I actually do not own an Oko yet, so...
And you're trying to collect all of the borderless planeswalkers, right?
Yes, but I am covered on Theros Beyond Death. Oh my god. You open these things, and they're just so shiny. Wow. You want me to read all these horrible comments?
No, don't read everything. Just read the... give us the highlights, Let's go along for the ride.
We got a foil Swamp, that's nice, and a foil Plains, Elspeth's Nightmare, foil Island. We got a bunch of lands. Oh my god, this is so sad. So the other problem with these is they do include some rares from the Planeswalker decks. So we've got an Ashiok's Forerunner. What does it do?
That's like the 4-mana creature that, like... What does it do?
You don't even know what this card does. This card goes and like searches your library for the like 12-mana Ashiok that was printed only in the Planeswalker deck.
Right, it goes and gets it. Which, I mean, I like that they put those cards in the Planeswalker decks because it lets people
for
play
sure.
their Planeswalkers more often. Yeah, 5-mana 3/3 with Flash that goes and gets stuff. The art's kind of cool, though. That's probably pretty foil.
Yeah. All right, we got an extended art Tectonic Giant. Cool.
Ooh, that one's good.
Neat. A foil Labyrinth of Scophos.
I was
Neat.
disappointed by something about that card. What was it that disappointed me about that card? Let me see.
It can't target your own creatures.
Yeah, bummer.
Yeah. So I had for a while Maze of Ith in my cube, specifically because there are a fair number of cards that you might want to attack with to get some attack trigger and then pull it out of combat to save it. But turned out to be just a little bit too oppressive. So I have Labyrinth in there now, and it's serviceable. Alright, next up we have a alt art Caliphate, Beloved of the Sea.
Those were some good alt arts. I liked them.
Yeah,
I
really
gotta say,
like
I'm not
those.
in love with the alt arts from Zendikar, the travel poster inspired ones. They're not.
Yeah, I'm completely with you. But it's important that they do things far from the beaten path because some of the things will be for you.
Exactly. I will always encourage Wizards taking risks, especially with their art direction, because what I want is just more weird stuff. And I'm okay if I hate 80% of it as long as I get 20% that I like, which is definitely, I think I'm hitting more often than that, so I will accept it.
All right, last card is foil alt art NX Hardened of the Forge. Hardened in
That's
Forge.
a good Magic card. Is that in your cube?
It's not. It's on the fence. It's definitely viable.
It'll be very good. Continue to push
And
those
we also
proactive
get
decks.
a foil Tentacle token.
Ooh, for
That's-
your
that
Kraken,
might
we
be
should
the-
cut from your cube.
That might be the best thing. This pack was kind of a stinker.
This is why we don't open packs outside of drafts, but you can't
Yeah.
open a collector's booster in a draft. It's
You
not
really,
nice.
you really can't. You could bring one to a wacky draft and have a good time.
Be generous to everybody.
Well, that was fun.
Yeah.
Mostly I just wanted to give a shout out to our local game store, No Land Beyond, that has a new thing where you can subscribe and get a monthly box of all kinds of Magic products and craft cocktails. And yeah, I got some of these collector boosters, which is, anything in these times to get a little bit of novelty in my life is a huge value.
Yeah, if you're in the greater Baltimore, D.C. area, check out No Land Beyond. And also, email us and let's play Cube whenever this stupid pandemic's over.
Oh, yeah.
If you're listening to this and you're in the D.C. area, Maryland area, why aren't you playing Cube with us all the time?